Hi, and welcome to our session, Trajectory, Not Transaction, the real foundation of advisory relationships. My name is Will Hill. I'm a product manager at Thomson Reuters, and I help firms make that transition to being advisory-centered in their relationships as opposed to compliance-centered in their relationship. And I have the privilege of working with firms in that and helping our team work with firms in that transition. And over the years, as we have been doing that, one of the things we've really seen firms wrestle with is how to define those client relationships. And that is where this content comes from for today's session. Now, as firms try to debate what advisory services really mean, we get into a lot of conversations, discussions, rabbit trails, but what if we're trying to be too precise? And I realize that's a really far out thought, accountants being too precise, but really sometimes when we hear the word advisory, we pigeonhole it right to a service instead of thinking about the way that the relationships are managed. And how we may want to be more open in how this is defined, or maybe we need to be a little bit more open in what we're trying to define when it comes to advisory. So I think here that we have to ask ourselves one question. So is advisory a trendy way of saying consulting? I'm going to go ahead and give that the big red X and say that that's really not what is transpiring here. I think that if we look at consulting work, which certainly has its place, oftentimes it's done once, maybe a little bit devoid of greater context. The consulting work often is done in a little bit of a silo, if you will. May not have a lot of coaching that goes with it, and the focus really is on the impact that's there, right? Or so the concept and the impact that the concept is going to have, and not as much on what is the result and how do we achieve that result. Maybe splitting hairs a little bit there, but I think that advisory is a little bit more of a long-term thought process and concept than a pure consulting. And if you think I'm splitting hairs, you say, no, that's not how I define it. So maybe you define consulting the way I define advisory. And that's okay, but I want to say that advisory is really about this longer run. It's about this relationship over the long run, and that's why advisory relationships are about the trajectory and not about the transaction. That's that first element that I want to get into here when we talk about these relationships. Now, the word context is nowhere to be seen on your screen, but it certainly could be, right? Because how we frame relationships is the context in which we operate from. And when a customer comes to you in an advisory setting, they're not buying a service, they're buying a relationship. And it's important to know and trust that internally, but it's also important to communicate that with your clients. Our transparency from the start is this great foundation that we want to build on, right? And so the foundation of all of our services comes from the relationship. And if we're simply selling a service for the sake of service, we're doing a disservice to our clients because we're not able to help them understand why those things matter and see progression. We're also doing a disservice to the likely reason why you are here in the first place, which is to help your clients move forward. And if we simply sell a set of services, we never sell the real relationship, we're not going to be able to help them move forward. We're going to be focused on simply doing a task, simply doing a task. And that's where we get outside of the advisory relationship. So we have to think about this as that holistic foundation and saying, the advisory services that we do, these are the relationships. It is not about the compliance work. The advisory service we do is the center of where we're going. And one of the questions that I get asked is, okay, well, how do we execute on this type of a relationship? don't pardon the alliteration. I actually love alliteration, so you wouldn't be surprised that it was here. 3 areas I want to touch on. The first is clear expectation. Clear expectation. Now, this is not just about, does the client know what we're going to do for them? But this is about, does the client know what's expected of them as we deliver the service? This is also about internally. Are we all on the same page with what we're doing for this customer? One of the advisory relationships is that they tend to extend to the firm as a whole. And so I have to understand more, again, that context that I'm doing these services in. If we've got an advisory relationship and my person doing some bookkeeping work or doing tax preparation work sees something, they ought to be able to, maybe that's an opportunity that they see or an issue that they see. They ought to be able to raise that in context of the whole relationship. Everybody ought to know what the deal is with each of the clients that they're working on and not be left wondering, what does this matter? And I'm just going to do the work in front of me. Those clear expectations internally and externally have great value. The second way that we execute an advisory relationship is by creating conversation space. And by this, I mean on purpose, right? I don't mean, well, they can call me anytime they want, or, well, sometimes they don't deliver their work, so we call them and say, hey, you've got to give us your source document so we can get your work done. I'm talking about intentional conversation space, where the point of getting together is to have conversation. And that's where we say, this is creating the space to talk about what's going on, where you want to go, challenges you're facing. Are we doing well against the directives we've set previously? Do we need to shift those? Do we need to maintain? Do we need to amp those up? Those are things that we need to have conversation for. And if we don't carve out the time for that, it's not going to happen. Or it's going to come up way too late, and we won't be able to do anything with it. So if we're going to sell an advisory relationship, we have to account for space. It doesn't have to be complex. Maybe this is a matter of, we're going to deliver the tax return. When that's done, we're going to talk about that then, maybe in April and May. And we're going to have another conversation in the fall, sometime around planning time. And you could just say, at our base level, that's going to be our conversation space. And maybe other clients, you amp that up a little bit, and there's another 1 to 3 times that you're having some conversation again, and using that space to talk about, where are they going? How do you need to change what you're doing? Identifying other opportunities. It's going to be great value for your business clients, is that conversation space. The other piece that you need to execute in an advisory relationship is you need coaching tools. And you need not just any old coaching tool will do, but you need a coaching tool that's written in their language. Did you know we have a language barrier in the accounting industry today? Right? And that is all the jargon that we use. Now, we're not the only profession that uses jargon. For example, my wife is a nurse. And that is a whole nother language. Here's the difference, though, between when doctors and nurses talk to somebody that they're working with as a patient or their customer, and when accountants talk to somebody that they're working with as a customer, is that the doctors and nurses know that their patients and customers do not understand the words that they're using. They know that even if they were to sort of heard the word before, they don't understand the impact. So they are planning on coaching. They are planning on teaching as part of that relationship. When we step into the accounting industry, we use words that are normal. And no offense to doctors and nurses, but we use words that are normal. Profit, revenue, expense, cash flow, tax. These are not hard to understand words. But the problem is, because they're simple to understand, our clients aren't asking questions about them because they say, I think I ought to know what you mean by the impact of cash flow. And so because I think I ought to know, because the words sound simple, I'm afraid to look dumb and ask that question. So I'm going to just sit here and nod. Besides, if it were complicated, you would have explained it to me. Meanwhile, the accountant is sitting on the other side of the desk saying, they're just sitting there nodding. They must understand what we mean by the impact of cash flow. There's no questions here. We're just going to keep moving forward. So we have to realize there's a real language barrier there, and we've got to find ways to coach and educate in their language and speak their language. As you do that, let's go back up to the conversation space. That's going to become an even more valuable time. So as they know that you're going to connect dots, break things down in your coaching tools, they're going to be more willing to ask the right questions, a little bit more open in that conversation space with you, a little bit less guarded, because they understand that this education piece has to come from open sharing on both parties to really be impactful. Now, as we do this, we have to continually say, are all of our expectations still in line? And do things change? So when we have a conversation, we identify this new opportunity, it doesn't mean, oh, we have to all of a sudden do that for them because we're in an advisory relationship. Our advisory relationship still has scope. When we get in this conversation space, if we identify something where we need to help facilitate action, behavior change for them, then we may modify the scope of our engagement with them and add that service in, right? So it's not like we've got conversation space, they're getting everything for free. This is about, are we helping them do what we're already engaged to do? And if there's other areas where we can help them in a new or a heightened level of engagement, let's have that conversation as well. And it's going to come out of a known reason. And when the client brings these needs up that they have in that conversation space, or as they go through some of their coaching and they want to go into a different direction, you're not as much in a selling position as you are in a meeting their needs that they have voice position. And that's a very different dynamic to that relationship. When your relationship with a customer is based on transactions, you can't have that conversation without it feeling like a hard sales pitch. But when your relationship is centered on the trajectory of where they are going, then you can have that conversation. And it makes sense to them because they see how your next service moves them further down the road, closer to their goals of where they are trying to reach to. So if we think about that on the prior slide was how we execute, what if you say, I think I'm doing that. How do I know if I'm doing that? And we know based on what it looks like. So step back and say, do I know the longer term goals of my client? If I don't understand the longer term goals of my clients, I probably don't have an advisory centric relationship. Now, to be fair, you may have an advisory centric relationship with a number of clients, but some you may not. Nature of the beast. But if you don't know the longer term goals of your customer, it's not an advisory centric relationship. The second point here is one I kind of touched on a little bit and I want to spend a little more time on. That is facilitating change. If our relationship is about the trajectory of where we're going, we know that if they don't do things differently or they don't change what they're doing now, they're probably not going to hit that outcome. They've got to make an adjustment. If they didn't need to make an adjustment, why are they talking to you? If things would just kind of happen naturally, they wouldn't need your help. The reality is we have to help facilitate change. Remember that facilitating change is not about complex steps, but it's about how do I find the simple way? It has to be about the simple way because change is already hard in and of itself just from a psychological perspective. And now if to follow the steps is complex, I'm less likely to follow through. So I've got to find a way to make it simple. I think sometimes in our industry, we've tried to say, what's the most complex way we can show what we need them to do to build our value? It's not about how complex it is that builds your value. Your value is in helping them reach their goal and what their goal means to them. Another way that we see advisory-centric relationships and how those are shown is that we manage them entirely through scope and not through time. Our relationship is managed through scope and not through time. We don't send the bill out because we talked to them for a certain amount of time. We have said, this is the service we're going to give you. And it's up to the firm to do it efficiently. It's up to the firm to manage the resources well, because all the client really cares about is not your time. All the client cares about is, are we getting the end result we agreed we were going to chase after? Are we seeing the outcome? Are we seeing the success? I'm sorry, but our clients don't care if you do it in 5 seconds or 50 hours. That does not change their internal perception of what they ought to pay. The outcome and the impact to them is what drives value. And that's how we ought to manage that relationship is, what are we doing for you? And then it becomes incumbent on the firm to use technology well, to evaluate their processes, to align their resources, kind of move the chess pieces where they are best leveraged for the sake of the firm. It's not the client's concern. Their concern is, what are you doing for me? Where are the boundaries? And then we're able to move forward in that way. The last bullet here has become one of my favorite sayings, is that we know it's an advisory relationship when the compliance work is a progress report and it's not the task to be done. Let me say that again. When the compliance work is a progress report and not the task to be done. I ought to help a client make progress towards their goals and then go back to the tax return, the balance sheet, and say, because we've been doing these things with you, because we've helped you change the way you manage your cash, because we've formed the new entity, this is the impact on your bottom line. I'm not doing the return, doing the balance sheet, doing the income statement for the sake of it itself. I'm doing it because, yes, we've got a compliance requirement from the government and a regulation piece, but I'm doing that and we're showing that we've been effective. We're showing where things go. And that's where I want you to think a little bit about the compliance work. All of these items you ought to talk about upfront with your clients. So with a new client coming in, you ought to immediately start talking about longer term goals. You ought to talk about how you manage the relationship and your view on compliance work. Chances are it's very different from their prior accounting relationship. And so you need to set those expectations up front. You need to talk to them about how you want to partner with them to reach those longer term goals. You want to be there to help them change the way they're behaving so that they can more easily reach those goals or reach their goals with less of a risk level. That conversation has to happen up front as you go through. Now, if you're here and you've got a firm, most likely you already have existing relationships and you're thinking, what do I do now? Well, find that opportunity for conversation. When something changes, maybe you just use the business life cycle of your customer. Something changes for them. They're thinking about expansion, they're thinking about growth, maybe they're thinking about succession. Whatever it is that they're thinking about, come in and say, maybe it's time we redo the way we work together. Let's help you in this cycle of life with your business. And let's bring the way we relate to one another around achieving goals for that. And that'd be a great way for you to move in. I think that when we think about being that advisor, it's not always about doing all the work, but it's about the value you have in order for them to achieve what they want to achieve. When it comes to business and their business, in a lot of ways, you're teaching them how to be an artist. And as you do that, you're telling them, look, you're the one that's an artist, but I'm teaching you, where do you want to shade deeper? Where do you want to change the coloration? Where do you want to extend the picture? Where do we want to cut the picture? You are there helping guide and direct the movements they're making as they are trying to make their business masterpiece. You, as the trusted advisor, are the key element for that. That's why that their goals have to be centered. and you want to say, I'm running an advisory firm, then you ought to know the goals. What masterpiece is that client trying to create, and help them, because you have the knowledge of what levers to push and pull to make that business their real and their true masterpiece. And that's what we want to see coming from you as that trusted advisor to the firm. I hope this has been an insightful perspective on advisory relationships, and you're able to take something away from here and say, this is where we want to move and how we gain some advisory relationships. If you'd like more conversation on that, I'd encourage you to listen to a podcast that I host on a weekly basis called Pulse of the Practice. We get into a lot of these types of conversations, and as well as the program that we head up at Thomson Reuters called Practice Forward for firms that say, I want some outside help to really dive in headfirst into advisory and get traction quickly. That's what we're there to do with Practice Forward. At any rate, thank you for your time today, and I look forward to hearing the stories of how you help your clients truly achieve their goals because of the advisory nature of your relationship. Thank you.